Summer 1943. The jungle was alive in a way that felt almost cruel. Its thick vines twisting like veins around the trunks of trees, its air swollen with the perfume of rot and the whine of insects. Boots sank into black mud that clung like tar, each step a reminder that this was not terrain to be conquered so much as endured. The men of Lieutenant William Keegan's patrol moved in single file, rifles low, eyes straining against the green haze. They had been in the Pacific long enough to know that silence here was not peace. It was camouflage. Keegan was 30, the kind of officer whose uniform seemed perpetually too clean, his speech too careful. He had studied history at Harvard, a man who once lectured on the Peloponnesian War, before finding himself flung into another kind of jungle, this one alive with enemies who did not debate, only ambushed. His men respected him for his calm voice and his refusal to waste them on foolish charges. But respect was fragile out here. Respect had to be fed with survival. Behind him trudged Sergeant Jack Callahan, wiry and restless, with a mop of auburn hair that never stayed down beneath his helmet. The men called him Red, and his weapon, the squat, drum-throated Thompson submachine gun, seemed as much a part of him as his quick temper. He had grown up fighting in the alleys of South Boston, fists like flint, tongue sharper still. He had a habit of addressing his Thompson like it was an old flame. "Sing for me, Maggie," he would mutter, stroking the steel as if coaxing a tune. 2 steps behind came Corporal Sam Ortega, younger, calmer, his eyes carrying that patient mischief found in men who could joke their way through misery. A son of migrant farmers from New Mexico, Ortega had learned endurance in dust and drought before the war, demanded it in another climate altogether. He carried mortar shells, heavy burdens strapped across his shoulders, and yet still found breath for humor. He was the one who reminded the others they were still human. The Japanese laughed first. It came from the trees ahead, a cruel, mocking sound, distant yet sharp. Private Hiroshi Nakamura, barely 21, was among them. He had left Tokyo with promises of honor and empire ringing in his ears, but now found himself crouched beneath dripping leaves, watching foreign soldiers stumble through mud. The laughter was meant as bait, mockery to rattle nerves, to lure rash charges. Their commander, Captain Kenjiro Takeda, had ordered it so. A man of rigid discipline, Takeda believed that contempt was a weapon as useful as bullets. The object of that laughter was Callahan's Thompson. The Japanese had learned to recognize its thick silhouette, its gangster heritage. They called it the toy gun, the Chicago relic, a noisy indulgence unsuited for the discipline of war. Bolt-action Arisakas, they believed, had reach and precision. The Thompson had only noise. Nakamura, obedient, laughed as instructed, though deep in his stomach, unease coiled. For he had heard rumors. In the tangle of jungle, where sight lines collapsed to mere yards, that toy spat led like a storm. Callahan bristled at the sound. His freckled face tightened, his jaw working against the heat that already made sweat sting his eyes. He wanted to fire blindly into the brush, drown out laughter with thunder. But Keegan raised a hand, palm flat. "Patience," the lieutenant murmured. His voice was soft but carried steel. "Let them show themselves." The patrol moved again, slower now, the laughter receding like ghosts in the undergrowth. Ortega broke the tension with a whisper. "They think Maggie's a toy, Red. Maybe you should play them a lullaby." Callahan smirked, but the line fell flat against the humidity, the gnawing awareness that every vine might conceal a rifle barrel. The jungle was not neutral. It played favorites. It magnified sound, turned footsteps into betrayals, twisted trails until compasses lied. It was a second enemy, one without flag or face. Men spoke of it like a beast, alive and hungry. And tonight, it seemed to purr for the Japanese. Keegan halted the column on a ridge where the canopy thinned. From here, he could see a strip of river glinting like dull metal. The place looked peaceful, which made it dangerous. He crouched low, signaling the men to fan out. Callahan's eyes flicked across the tree-line, every shadow a threat. Ortega muttered something about home, tortillas and coffee, the kind of idle comfort that men carried like talismans. Then it came again, the laughter sharper, closer, a deliberate echo bouncing through bamboo stalks. This time Callahan snapped. He raised Maggie and squeezed the trigger. The Thompson's bark shattered the silence, a chattering roar that rolled through the jungle like a drumline. Branches snapped, leaves shredded, birds erupted in panicked flight. For a heartbeat, the forest itself seemed to recoil, but no bodies fell. The laughter had already vanished, slipping back into the green. Keegan hissed, "Control yourself, Sergeant." Callahan spat into the mud, muttering, "They'll learn soon enough." Miles away, Nakamura crouched, heart hammering. The burst of .45 slugs had torn through the brush mere yards from his position. He had laughed, yes, but the sound of that gun was not comedy. It was hunger, relentless and close. Takeda's voice cut through the nerves. "Patience. We bleed them tomorrow." Night settled like a wet blanket, heavy and absolute. The Americans dug shallow foxholes, swatting at mosquitoes that seemed immune to repellent. Callahan cleaned Maggie by moonlight, every stroke of his rag a ritual, as if keeping the gun's voice sharp enough to answer mockery. Ortega hummed softly, a tune from home, while Keegan wrote in his pocket journal, words meant for no one but himself. He noted the laughter, the way it carried through the jungle, how it seemed both tactic and taunt. He wondered what kind of soldier laughed before killing. He wondered if his men would be alive to learn the answer. At dawn, the jungle woke with a scream of parrots and the buzz of cicadas. The patrol rose, stiff and sore, sweat already painting their backs. Callahan slung Maggie over his shoulder, eyes sharp, mouth set. Ortega stretched and joked, "If we make it through today, Red, I'll buy you a jukebox when we're home." Callahan didn't answer. The laughter came again, faint and taunting, drifting on the humid air. This time, though, there was something different in its edge. Not just mockery, challenge. The Japanese were not merely ghosts now. They were hunters circling closer. Keegan lifted his hand for silence, every muscle taut, eyes locked on the dense wall of bamboo ahead. The laughter swelled, then cut off as abruptly as a throat slit. For a moment, the jungle was still, too still, and even the cicadas seemed to hush. Callahan's grip tightened on the Thompson. Ortega exhaled slowly, as if bracing for a punch. Keegan lowered his hand, whispering so softly it was almost lost in the air, "It's coming." And from deep in the trees, unseen yet unmistakable, the jungle answered with a metallic snick of rifles being readied. The laughter had been only the overture. The real performance was about to begin. The jungle struck first. One moment the patrol moved through curtains of vines, their boots squelching against mud slick as oil, and the next, the trees themselves seemed to split open with fire. Arasaka rifles cracked from hidden angles, their sharp barks ricocheting through the canopy. Bullets chewed bark, snapped leaves, and bit into the soil so close to Keegan's boots he felt the dirt sting his ankles. He threw himself flat, shouting orders that were instantly drowned by the chaos. Callahan did not wait. Maggie roared to life, her .45 slugs hammering the green wall ahead. The Thompson's staccato clatter tore the silence apart, and where the Arasaka offered a single, distant note, the Tommy gun bellowed in chords, raw and overwhelming. Vines shredded into pulp, bamboo split like brittle bones. The laughter of yesterday dissolved into guttural shouts. Callahan's freckled face was twisted in a snarl, his eyes blazing with something between fury and release. Ortega crouched beside him, hands fumbling for mortar shells he had no chance to set. The jungle's close quarters made his weapon useless. He cursed under his breath, sweat rolling down his cheek as he shifted to feed extra magazines into Callahan's eager hands. "Keep her singing, Red," he muttered, forcing steadiness into his voice. From the tree-line came figures, lean men in faded khaki, bayonets flashing like silver teeth. Nakamura was among them, heart slamming in his chest as he sprinted forward. He had been taught that the rifle's reach would always defeat the Tommy's bark, but here, 10 paces from death, range meant nothing. The American's weapon did not pause to breathe. Its storm of slugs filled the air like hornets. Nakamura saw the man wielding it. Fiery hair, eyes lit with madness. And for a brief, shattering moment, the mocking laughter of his comrades seemed obscene. Keegan's voice cut through. Flank right. Pin them. He rose from the mud, pistol in hand, firing with a calm precision that belied the shriek of bullets around him. His training spoke through him. Every command clipped, steady, anchoring the men who otherwise might have scattered like startled deer. The firefight collapsed in his smoke and screams. Callahan advanced, Thompson spitting fire, cutting arcs into the jungle's green curtain. He did not fire in short bursts as manuals advised. He held the trigger until the weapon bucked like a living thing, muzzle glowing, hands trembling from the recoil. The Japanese dropped back, shocked at the sheer wall of lead. Their rifles, meant for careful shots, could not answer this frenzy. Still, Takeda had planned well. Hidden machine guns opened, their streams of fire stitching the air. One round clipped the edge of Ortega's pack, sending him sprawling. He cursed, scrambling to his knees, eyes wide with the sudden knowledge that he had almost been erased. Keegan pulled him up by the collar, dragging him behind a fallen tree. "Stay breathing, Corporal," he growled, as if command alone could fend off death. Callahan pressed on, heedless. He was the storm now, his Thompson roaring louder than fear. To him, the jungle had become an alley in Boston, enemy shadows at the edge of his fists. Each squeeze of the trigger was a punch, each magazine a promise. He shouted something, words no one caught, and his men followed, drawn by the sheer gravity of his defiance. The Japanese fell back in fragments, confusion cracking their discipline. Nakamura stumbled into cover, chest heaving, rifle slick in his hands. He glimpsed a comrade collapse beside him, throat torn by the American slugs and nausea coiled hot in his gut. The Thompson had been a joke. Now it was a curse, a demon with a barrel for a mouth. He had never felt fear like this, not of men, but of a sound, relentless and unyielding. The firefight ebbed as quickly as it began. Smoke curled upward, mixing with the humidity until the air was soup. Bodies lay tangled in roots and vines, rifles jutting from the earth like broken branches. The jungle seemed to sigh, its violence spent for the moment. Keegan gathered his men, eyes darting, counting. They were alive, shaken, cut, bruised, but alive. And it was the Thompson, no, it was Callahan, that had torn them a path through the ambush. For a while no one spoke. Ortega leaned against a tree, wiping grime from his face with trembling hands. "Red," he finally said, voice hoarse, "you and that toy just saved all our hides. Remind me never to laugh at gangsters again." His grin was weak, but it broke the tension like a flare in the dark. Callahan slid the empty magazine free, sweat dripping into his eyes. His chest heaved, his arms ached, but Maggie had not failed him. He stared at the smoking barrel, as if it were alive, as if it had chosen not to betray him. "She ain't a toy," he muttered, voice rough. "She's a damn choir." Keegan knelt, scribbling notes in his journal with hands still stained from mud and powder. He wrote not of tactics, but of sound, the way one weapon's voice had drowned another. He wrote of laughter, of how quickly it could turn into screams. He did not know what larger truth he was chasing, only that the Thompson had proved something undeniable today. Across the line, Nakamura and the remnants of his squad pulled back under Takeda's orders. The captain's face was tight, unreadable, but inside he burned with disbelief. He had mocked the American weapon, dismissed it as decadent. Yet his men had been torn apart by its storm. He vowed quietly that they would adapt, that the jungle itself would conspire to swallow the Tommy's thunder. As the Americans regrouped, Ortega offered Callahan a canteen. "You ever think, Red," he said between gulps of water, "that maybe Maggie's the loudest voice in this whole damn jungle?" Callahan smirked, weary but defiant. "Then let him hear her," he replied. The sun clawed higher, turning the canopy into a furnace. Flies swarmed the fallen, the air sour with blood. Keegan ordered a march deeper into the interior, knowing more ambushes waited, knowing the jungle was not finished with them. Each man shouldered his fear like another piece of gear, heavy but necessary. Behind them, the silence was not peace but rehearsal. In the trees, beyond sight, Takeda's men whispered, planning. The Americans had survived the baptism, yes, but the jungle was patient, and so was he. As Callahan adjusted Maggie on his shoulder, a flicker of movement caught his eye, a shadow, swift, deliberate, gone before he could raise the barrel. The laughter did not come this time, only the hush, deeper than before. As if the forest itself had inhaled and was waiting to exhale, summer's rains came heavy, drenching the jungle in sheets that blurred vision and turned every path into a river of mud. The men slogged forward, uniforms plastered to their skin, boots sucking at the ground with every exhausted step. The firefights had become routine now, sudden eruptions of violence that left the Americans rattled but somehow still breathing. And in every clash, it was Callahan's Thompson that answered first, its stuttering thunder breaking ambushes before they could consume the patrol. The weapon had become a talisman, a sound that meant survival, and though the men still cursed the heat and the rot, they moved with a grim faith whenever Maggie's voice rose through the chaos. Callahan himself seemed bound to the gun in a way that unnerved even Ortega. He cleaned it in silence after every fight, oiling every part, brushing grit from the chamber with a devotion that looked almost like worship. Once, Ortega teased him. "You gonna marry that thing when we get home?" And Callahan only gave a thin smile, muttering, "Already spoken for." He had carved letters into the stock, rough scratches spelling out M and C, initials of a girl back in Boston whose photograph he kept tucked in his breast pocket. The Thompson, heavy and scarred, was his voice in this place, the only way he could promise her he was still fighting. Keegan watched it all with an uneasy fascination. He had expected leadership to be measured in tactics and discipline, yet here it was forged in noise and fury. The Thompson was more than a weapon. It had become a symbol of defiance, of refusing to die quietly in a jungle designed to swallow them whole. In his journal, he wrote lines that read like sermons. The jungle laughs at rifles, but it kneels to the drumbeat of the Tommy. He wondered if history would remember it as clearly as his men already did. The Japanese learned, too. Nakamura's squad whispered to the American demon, a red-haired gunner whose weapon spat fire without pause. Some called it the drumbeat, others the thundermouth. The myths grew faster than facts, and fear threaded itself into their ambushes. Takeda, however, would not bend to superstition. He studied the reports, the casualties, and dismissed talk of demons. To him, the Thompson was not magic. It was a machine, and every machine could be broken. Yet the machine refused to quit. Rain clogged barrels, mud swallowed cartridges, the air itself seemed designed to rust metal, but still Maggie sang. Even when Callahan stumbled with fever burning in his skin, the weapon did not falter. Ortega took his arm, steadying him, muttering jokes about carrying both man and gun if need be. But Callahan shook his head, wiped the sweat from his eyes, and dragged himself upright. "As long as I can pull a trigger," he rasped, "she won't let me down." There were nights when the patrol huddled in foxholes, listening to the jungle breathe. Lightning forked above the canopy, thunder rolling like distant artillery. Keegan's men would whisper of home, of warm meals and quiet streets, and inevitably someone would ask Callahan to speak of Boston. He would sit in the dark, Maggie across his knees, and describe the harbor, the smell of salt and smoke, the clamor of dockside markets. The Thompson gleamed faintly in the dim light, rainwater beating on its stock, and it seemed less a weapon than a relic carried from another world. For Nakamura, fear turned to fascination. During one skirmish, pinned behind a tree as slugs shredded bark around him, he thought not of dying, but of how such a weapon existed. His Arasaka felt ancient, too slow, too rigid for this new kind of war. He saw Callahan in glimpses, a flash of hair, a snarl, the glint of steel, and felt the myth tighten its grip. Later, as he cleaned his rifle, he whispered to himself that perhaps the Americans had indeed found a way to give steel a soul. Takeda would not allow reverence. After a failed ambush cost him 20 men, he gathered his officers and spoke with cold fury. "It is not the gun," he snapped. "It is the man. Break the man, and the gun will fall silent." His eyes burned with the determination of one who refused humiliation. He promised that the next ambush would not fail, that numbers and patience would crush even the most stubborn machine. The Americans marched on, battered but unbroken, their faith in the Thompson deepening with every fight. Ortega began calling it the choir, joking that every burst was a hymn to survival. Even Keegan allowed himself a smile at the line, though privately he feared the cost of such dependence. What if the gun failed? What if Callahan fell? Yet each dawn brought another ambush, another storm of fire, and each time Maggie sang, dragging them through to another dusk. Then came the valley of bamboo spears. The patrol descended into it unaware, shadows closing in from every ridge. Takeda had laid his trap with precision. Machine guns hidden in the trees, mortars positioned to fall like rain, riflemen circling like wolves. Nakamura crouched among them, rifle tight in his grip, his fear braided with anticipation. This was no taunt, no feigned laughter. This was the kill that would end the myth of the Tommy gun. The first shots ripped into the column, men diving for cover as explosions shredded the earth. Ortega shouted, dragging Keegan into a shallow ditch, while Callahan stood firm, Maggie already roaring. The sound of it filled the valley, a relentless scream of defiance that clashed with the Japanese gunfire in a symphony of death. Callahan's figure was half obscured by smoke, his silhouette framed by muzzle flash, and to both friend and foe alike he looked like something beyond human, a conductor in the orchestra of war. The jungle shook with violence, and yet through it all, one truth hammered itself into every heart. The weapon would not quit. Callahan's hands blistered, his arms ached, but still he held the trigger. Each burst ripped open the trap, each magazine another chance at breath. Men who had once laughed now flinched at the very sound, their confidence unraveling as the myth proved itself in steel and fire. Keegan, crouched beside Ortega, felt the shift like a tide turning. This was no longer battle, it was testament. They were not just fighting to survive. They were fighting to prove that ridicule could become reverence, that what was mocked as a toy could break the teeth of an empire. And as the valley filled with smoke and screams, Takeda's eyes narrowed. He had underestimated not just the gun, but the stubborn will bound to it. His ambush would either bury the myth or make it immortal. Rain hammered the valley like 1,000 fists against tin, blurring vision, swallowing sound, but inside the roar of weather another rhythm pulsed, the staccato drumbeat of the Thompson. Callahan stood knee-deep in mud, red hair plastered to his skull, hands clenched around Maggie's sweating steel frame. The barrel smoked, hissed in the downpour, but still it spat its .45 slugs into the bamboo thickets. Each burst was an act of defiance, an oath screamed into the storm. Keegan crouched nearby, his pistol nearly useless in the swell of the fight. He watched Callahan, watched the fire that refused to dim, and felt a strange knot form in his chest. Leadership, he realized, wasn't always a map or an order. Sometimes it was one man refusing to fall when everything conspired to break him. Ortega scrambled beside him, feeding magazines forward like a priest offering bread at a desperate mass. His usual jokes were gone, his jaw set, his hands shaking as he shoved another clip into Callahan's palm. From the ridges above, Takeda unleashed his trap. Mortars cracked open the earth, flinging mud and bone skyward. Machine guns sewed curtains of fire across the valley, trying to stitch the Americans into the dirt. Takeda's eyes blazed with calculation. He had staked everything on this one overwhelming strike. Break the man with the Tommy, and the myth would die with him. But the jungle betrayed him. The range he trusted collapsed to nothing in the rain and smoke. Japanese riflemen, trained for distance, found themselves staring across no more than 20 yards of tangled foliage. And in that distance, the Thompson was king. Callahan surged forward, every step a refusal, every pull of the trigger a counterargument to mockery. Men fell before him, their shadows swallowed by the mud. Nakamura fired wildly, his Arisaka jerking against his shoulder. He saw comrades shredded, bamboo splitting as if the jungle itself was bleeding. His earlier laughter haunted him, a ghost echoing back with cruelty. He ducked behind a root, breath ragged, ears filled with the thunder of a weapon that seemed immune to silence. He thought of his mother in Tokyo, of honor, of promises made, and felt all of them dissolve into the wet soil. Ortega shouted above the storm, "Red, they're going to burn your hands off." Callahan's reply was a ragged laugh, wild, desperate, yet alive. "Better my hands than my men." His voice cracked like the very gun he held. Keegan, watching, felt pride and terror in equal measure. He wanted to drag the sergeant back, but some part of him knew this was the fight that would either immortalize them or bury them nameless. Takeda raged, his orders barked through the smoke. He urged his men forward, bayonets gleaming, but each charge collapsed beneath the Thompson's roar. Still he refused to yield. "Numbers," he hissed. "Numbers will drown them." Yet with every fresh wave, the valley answered with the same sound. Maggie's voice, a relentless storm that no body could outrun. The air stank of cordite and rain, of blood steaming against wet earth. Callahan's arms trembled, muscles screaming, but his eyes never wavered. He was no longer just a man with a gun. He was the embodiment of survival, of refusal. Maggie coughed and chattered, each burst shorter, the barrel glowing faintly, but she would not quit. Ortega's hands were raw from reloading, his shirt torn, but still he grinned through clenched teeth. "Sing it, choir," he muttered. "Sing it till they're gone." Keegan raised his head above the ditch, caught sight of Takeda across the chaos. For a moment, officer met officer, two wills colliding across smoke and distance. Takeda's face was tight with disbelief, as though the universe itself had betrayed his logic. Keegan lifted his pistol, fired a single shot. It missed, but the symbolism struck true. Reason against rage, calm against fury. Nakamura stumbled forward, desperate to end the madness. He leveled his rifle, sighted the red-haired gunner. His finger tightened, but before he could fire, Callahan's Thompson spoke. A burst shattered the air, and Nakamura's rifle spun from his grip. He collapsed in a mud, not dead but broken, ears filled with that unending roar. As he drifted into unconsciousness, his last thought was bitter clarity. They had laughed, and now they were paying the price of their arrogance. The battle broke not with silence, but with exhaustion. The Japanese line wavered, then cracked, shadows fleeing into the dripping green. Takeda himself was dragged back by his men, his vow unfulfilled, his legend unraveling. The valley was left to the Americans, smoking, sodden, littered with the debris of defiance. Callahan collapsed to one knee, Maggie cradled against his chest like a wounded comrade. His face was pale, lips trembling, hands blistered raw, but his eyes still blazed. Ortega dropped beside him, chest heaving, laughter bubbling through exhaustion. "You did it, Red." Damn thing wouldn't shut up. Keegan placed a hand on both their shoulders, his journal forgotten, his words simple. "They'll never laugh at her again." The rain eased, leaving only the drip of water from leaves, the hiss of cooling steel, the labored breaths of men who had survived the impossible. The jungle seemed to bow in silence, its mockery finally stilled. And then, from somewhere deep beyond the ridges, faint but unmistakable, another sound rose, the echo of laughter. Not the careless mockery of before, but something darker, sharper, a promise. The war was not done. The jungle still had voices waiting in its shadows.